Welcome to the Radical Centrist Podcast, where we explore a politics that steps outside of the realm of the poisonous partisanship that has infected our country in recent years. And we seek ways to place the American voice, the American idea, above tribalism, partisan politics, and blind allegiance to ideology. To challenge ourselves to ask questions and seek answers that can bridge the divides between people, parties, and ideologies. Radical centrism is not quiet and meek, but outspoken and unapologetic. Radical centrism celebrates raucous debate, tempered with civility and humility. Fair warning. Be careful when you listen to these podcasts. You may find yourself opening your mind to the possibilities that suddenly come available to us when we listen to one another. This is your host, Wayne King, and my ultimate goal is to create aha moments where the conservative blue-collar worker or the businesswoman down the road and the liberal academic from the local college find themselves saying, that's an interesting idea. If I can just once in a while set off that light bulb, then I have the chance to convince you that there is real value in talking to one another, and more important, in listening to one another. If we listen, really listen to one another, we can find a way to express our American voice, the one that celebrates our common ideals and respects our differences. If we can find our American voice, then maybe, just maybe, we can sing together too. What a joyous sound that would be. So let's get started.
This song is dedicated to the people of the world and all its inhabitants. We've got to learn to live together with some understanding and care for each other. Let's go the extra mile and do it with a smile. Said if it's true, tell me why we cannot try. Tell me why, yes, if there is a reason why. If it's true, tell me why we cannot try.
My thanks to reggae musician Free Joseph for providing the music to us for this podcast from his critically acclaimed CD, He Is Here, singing Tell Me Why. Free has just returned from a 10-year sojourn in his native Dominica, and I am expecting very big things of him. His music is available from his website, freejoseph.net, or from iTunes or wherever you purchase your favorite music. We are currently in the process of booking gigs for November and December of 2024. And if you have an interest in speaking with someone about that, there'll be information in the show notes about how to contact us. We are also in the midst of planning an international reconciliation concert tour that will begin in Cape Coast, Ghana at the Slave Coast Departure Castle. If you'd like more information about that, you can join our mailing list and we'll keep you informed.
I never gave up my identity. I didn't think I was an Indian. I didn't act like I was an Indian. What I saw instead was a power of spirit in the people that was different than anything I had ever seen before. Our understanding of Native people is either mythologizing or pathologizing. They're either these sacred, wonderful Indians, or they're just a bunch of layabout, lazy drunks on welfare and getting casino money.
Right.
In the middle are the real people who have this deep layer of spirituality about them that doesn't show up immediately. You have to be around them to know it. And I thought I could tell this man's story, and I could tell the story using him, which is what he suggested. I could use him to tell the stories of both what had happened to them and what it is that they believed about life.
That is Kent Nerburn. Kent is the author of 16 different books, mostly related to spirituality, many of them the spirituality of the Native American community. This year is the 25th anniversary of the release of his book, Neither Wolf Nor Dog, which was also made into a movie. Kent occupies a prominent place in the pantheon of writers who observe and document Native life in a world where real people meet the challenges of real life amid the simplistic mythologizing and pathologizing characterizations of Native people, to which we are all drawn from time to time. Kent does not avoid controversy in his writing process. He sees it as exploring what the author Jonathan Rauch calls the constitution of knowledge, a healthy and robust discussion of ideas that allow us to develop revealed knowledge and truth from frank and often ongoing dialogue. Precisely what we advocate here on the Radical Centrist Podcast series. This podcast celebrates the 25th anniversary of the first publishing of Neither Wolf Nor Dog, On Forgotten Roads with an Indian Elder, documenting Kent's travels through Indian country with a Native American elder he calls Dan. This podcast is dedicated to the memory of Charles Bud Thompson, founder of the Canterbury Shaker Village Museum in Canterbury, New Hampshire, and at 68, founder of the Mount Kearsarge Indian Museum in Warner, New Hampshire. Though Kent and I have never actually met one another, both of us knew Bud and counted him as among our most cherished mentors. Here's my conversation. There we go.
All right.
Hey, Kent.
Hey, well, here we are. Thanks for asking me.
Here we are. Well, thank you for agreeing to do this.
You know why I did it. That's our friend Bud.
Yeah, well,
my guy.
Yeah, for folks who are watching and listening, Kent Nerburn and I have a friend in common who has left the earth at this point, Bud Thompson, who many folks from New Hampshire know as the founder of the Shaker Village Museum, as well as the Indian Museum at Mount Kearsarge, and he is a very important figure in both of our lives. Kent, we're going to do this in celebration of our pal Bud. Tell me about your relationship with Bud.
Bud contacted me at one point wanting me to come and talk at Mount Kearsarge. And I didn't know him. I get these invitations. And he said, well, we've got a place. You can stay with us. And I never stay with anyone. I'm sort of a misanthrope. I like to just have my own place. But Bud was gently persistently insistent. And I said, all right, fine. So I stayed at their house right by the Mount Kearsarge Indian Museum, and with his wife, Nancy, and they were, he rapidly became like a father to me. I mean, Bud was, I'm almost all the tread is worn off my tire right now. I'm 78, and Bud was how much older than I was? Maybe, well, Bud died at 99 last year.
Right.
But my father was gone. All of the adult people older than I am were gone. And it was like the roof was off my world. And suddenly I met this man that was like an elder and a father. And he was so engaged in the world. He was so aggrieved at what he saw going on. At the same time, he was so actively engaged in everything. And they just touched my heart. So I stayed with them against my better judgment. And luckily, I didn't take my better judgment because it wouldn't have been my better judgment. And we just became friends after that. And so I would go out and visit him. And because, when you get to a certain age, um, people just look at you as old. They really don't come to you for friendship. It's like it's almost as if it's an obligatory act to go, well, I need to go visit so and so, grandma, grandpa, Bud, whoever it was. But in Bud's case, it was more than that. He didn't impart any specific wisdom, but his whole character, his whole demeanor was one of such engagement with life that it was just a model for me. I mean, he walked the road ahead of me, and I'm continue to walk it, as do we all. But I just felt that I had met he'd been a real gift to me late in my life. So that's my story of Bud.
Ah, yeah. Well, we both have our own stories, and I suppose that I've told mine a few times before, but I think that his son Daryl and I went to UNH together, and um, the when I would go and visit them at the Shaker Village, I would always ask Bud to take me up into the attic where he
Mm.
stored all of the all of the things that he had gathered in his quest to do a second project in life, that being Mount Kearsarge, what would become Mount Kearsarge Indian Museum. And it was always such an adventure to go up there and just wander around. And and now here I am interviewing you on the anniversary, the 25th anniversary of this extraordinary book, Neither Wolf Nor Dog, which um, obviously you wrote 25 years ago, and you have distinguished yourself not only as a spiritual writer, but as a sort of a chronicler um, of Indian Native American uh, life in an honest and forthright way. Uh, it's interesting to me that when people describe your work, they aren't quite sure what box to put it in terms of, is this fiction? Is this nonfiction? Is this that's it's just beautiful work, and I want to talk about Neither Wolf Nor Dog, but I'd like to sort of get you to talk about what brought you to this place
The well, you mean the place of
in
doing
life.
Neither
I
Wolf
mean,
Nor Dog? Yeah.
where you have become uh,
Oh,
enmeshed and immersed in Indian life, but also in ways in which it relates to the spiritual thinking of all human beings.
sure. That well, I came upon the native world almost completely by accident. I'd grown up like most everyone else, right, during at Thanksgiving, we made a little turkey with our hands, drawing the outline of our hands, and the buckle shoe pilgrims, and with trading, trading gifts at Thanksgiving. That was what I knew. And I had a little chicken feather headdress or bow and arrow with little red rubber tips. That was it. And I was a suburban kid in Minneapolis. And so the Indians were the furthest thing in the world from my mind. But I came to them completely, it was pure serendipity. Uh, I trained as a sculptor, and I actually got my doctorate in theology and art. And the reason that I wanted to do this, my interest in spirituality is because I believe that we're all spiritual beings. I always have felt my own self as being alive to the mysteries of life, much more than to the practicalities. And I, I looked upon sculpture as a way to embody spiritual belief. So spiritual emotions. My doctorate actually was kind of doctrinaire in a way, in that it was a sculpture of John the Baptist out of a piece of black walnut. But it wasn't about John the Baptist so much as it was an image of someone who is a hollow reed for the Spirit to speak through him. And it was I did it out of walnut because I wanted to work in wood. I'd actually trained in Germany. I'd ended up, everywhere moves me backwards, but I won't go too far back. But I had gone to Germany years ago when I was in graduate school at Stanford, because I had gone to Stanford to study religion and art in a doctoral program. But it was very antiseptic. They would talk about theories of soteriology and idea. It was comparative, but it was bloodless. And I wanted belief. I wanted the powers of belief. I wanted to know what people believed. So anyway, they sent me off to Germany to learn German. I said I wasn't going to learn it in a language lab at 120 degrees in Palo Alto in the summer. And so they said, well, why don't you go to Germany? So I did, and long story short, I ended up working with a man who restored antiques. And he he didn't know any English, and I didn't know any German, and I had just stumbled upon him. And in the course of working with him, I ended up going to little museums in the town of Marburg. And there were these farmer museums where these farmers had carved pieces of wood, crucifixes, Madonnas, whatever, that they didn't have any technical skill, but what they had was pure heart. Things went right through them into the wood. And I said, this is what I want to do with my life. Went back to Stanford, said, I want to be a wood sculptor. And they said, we think you're having a nervous breakdown. Why don't you take a year off? And I did, and never turned back. I then went forward and studied sculpture, studied wood sculpture, and I was fascinated with wood and with trees. So that's what ended me up at Graduate Theological Union, studying belief and trying to embody it in pieces of wood. All right, so how do we get to the Indians from that? I was working, I would take a tree and I'd be, I worked in full-size trees. I didn't want laminated pieces of wood. I work from a tree trunk. And so I'd have these tree trunks maybe 6, 8 feet tall, and I would sculpt out of them. And I did it by hand. I wanted the feeling of the hand in the wood. I didn't want chainsaws and intervening variables like that. And so I gradually discovered that the wood had more power than the ideas that I was trying to impose upon it. I would work in a tree, and if you spend a year with anything or 6 months with anything alone in a room, you get to know it very well. A potted plant, a dog, a wife, anything, you get to figure them out, or they figure you out. And the trees started to talk to me in a way that was on a subliminal, not subliminal, it was subconscious, preconscious level. So I got my doctorate. I'm fascinated with the power of trees, and I'm trying to make my way as a sculptor. I come upon my wife and I moved to northern Minnesota, 100 miles from any freeway, and we're between 3 reservations. And a job came up to do an oral history project on the reservation. Actually, they wanted a history teacher. And I said, well, I can't teach history, but I have in the past run a newspaper. I know how to interview people. And what I could do is, if I go up there, maybe I'll learn something about the aesthetics of wood from the Indians, because they were the one group, the native people were the one group that talked about the power of material. the Iroquois would talk about carving masks into live trees in order to get the spirit of the tree in them. There were places on the Queen Charlotte's in British Columbia that would carve a face in a tree and let it grow and sort of become part of the tree and embody the image of the tree, the image they had carved in the tree. I knew they knew something. So that was my goal in going up there. But ultimately, my vehicle for getting involved in this reservation, and it was a closed reservation, and to those who were in New Hampshire, if that's where are you in New Hampshire?
Yes.
Or are we in? Yeah. Well, where you don't even have 1 square inch of native land left anymore. Minnesota is full of native of reservations. And this one I was working on was a closed reservation, Red Lake, meaning that the land was held in common. The people, they had their houses on it, but the tribe owned all of the land. And so it was a very private place, and it's about as big as Rhode Island, and nothing but trees and lakes. I'll go up there and I said, well, I would like to run an oral history project. I can't teach history to the kids because I don't want to impose my own Euro-American values on them. What I would like to do instead is go out and interview the tribal elders. So I get this group of kids and we go out and we start interviewing the tribal elders. And they are just so happy that someone is doing this because they were supposed to be the traditional teachers of the children. But they got this usurped from them when the American educational system was imposed upon them. So here was some naive, well-meaning white guy teacher saying, come on, let's go out and talk to the elders. So that became my world. And I did that for 2.5 years. We actually produced, this is one of the books we produced. It was called To Walk the Red Road, Memories of the Red Lake Ojibwe People. And that touched me in a way that sculpture had never really done. I mean, sculpture touched me. I always said sculpture was a way I'd save my soul, but writing was something I did very well. So I worked on these books and I'm good at it. And then I ended up getting fired because I got a little too close to the political intrigues of the reservation. So I'm without work. And yet I loved the time I spent on the reservation. The students loved me. The elders loved me. I loved them. It was a love fest in a very good way. But I didn't know what I could do. So then along came the opportunity traveling around with this book, with To Walk the Red Road, traveling on the Powwow Highway. So a man found it, a man named Dan, or a man I called Dan. And he was a Lakota man. And he saw this and he said, yeah, this guy does pretty well working with the kids. The kids trust him. The elders trusted him. I'd like to talk to him. And so from that grew Neither Wolf Nor Dog and the 2 books that followed, The Wolf at Twilight and The Girl Who Sang to the Buffalo. And the essence of them and the reason that they were successful and have been successful is because I never gave up my identity. I didn't think I was an Indian. I didn't act like I was an Indian. What I saw instead was a power of spirit in the people that was different than anything I had ever seen before. Our understanding of Native people is either mythologizing or pathologizing. They're either these sacred, wonderful Indians, or they're just a bunch of layabout, lazy drunks on welfare and getting casino money.
Right.
In the middle are the real people who have this deep layer of spirituality about them that doesn't show up immediately. You have to be around them to know it. And I thought I could tell this man's story, and I could tell the story using him, which is what he suggested. I could use him to tell the stories of both what had happened to them and what it is that they believed about life. And so by doing that, it came full circle for me. It brought me back to writing about spirituality because I was able to find people who didn't have a sectarian spirituality. For them, spirit inhered in everything in the world. And they didn't have what one of my a Confucian professor of mine in graduate school said was the curse of Western religion, and that was they were membership religions. And the Indians didn't have a membership religion. They had a religion of belief in the power of spirit in everything in the world. So here I was suddenly with opportunity to tell their stories. I knew I couldn't transgress into their world, but I could take the reader and say, come along with me. And I would write in the first person, I would bring you in and say, come along, let's go for a ride. And I'm going to take you to a place to where you've never been to meet some people that you didn't know existed. And I hand you over to Dan, Grover, Winona, and the people that I meet. And then they tell their story. And then it's a dialogue between my understanding and their understanding. And it's the journey we take. So that's, talk about put a nickel in to get an answer. There you put a nickel in and you just got about $4.50 worth of answer. So that's how I got to where I am.
So, how many books have you written altogether, Kent?
I think about 13, if you count edited books as well.
Boy, you are a prolific writer, but to what do you attribute sort of the lasting impact of Neither Wolf Nor Dog? I mean, 25 years and then releasing it again,
Mm-hmm.
on the 25th anniversary. What happened there that
Well,
made
yeah, it really was a blind pig and an acorn, and just finding an acorn kind of thing. That the fact that I really looked upon it as an oral history project with a story built around a story. And so by me keeping my own identity when I walked into the reservation, I could, and handing you over, as I said, to the people that I met, and then writing about our dialogue back and forth kept me from being some sort of a sycophant or a slavish chronicler. The closest anyone came, actually, now the term eludes me, that was someone said it was a type of immersive anthropology in a way. But the key to it was that I was retain my white identity, and if you identified with me as a white reader, a non-native reader, you trusted me, came with me, and then I handed you to the native people, and they trusted me because I knew how to chronicle their thoughts, and I would never violate Dan's words or the words of any of the people that I met. I might clean them up, but a perfect example is there's a scene in there where Dan and I are in Neither Wolf Nor Dog, where Dan and I are out driving, and I'm looking around the reservation. And if you've ever been on any of the reservations out west or much of any, they're full of junk cars and they're kind of trashy. And I sort of sidle up to the issue and say, well, you claim to revere the land. What's all this? What's all this junk? What about all the junk cars and everything? And Dan sort of goes off on me and says, but you call it a junk car? Yeah. It still has worth to me. I use it as a doghouse, and I might use it for car parts. It's like the buffalo. It's like we use all parts of the buffalo. We use the the horns for drinking cups. We use the sinew for needle and for threads and needles, the bones for needles. And he said, you don't use everything. You just use it and throw it away. And it's a very strong dialogue between the two of us. And he goes on about how we think, we don't think parking ramps are ugly on the earth, but we get mad when they've got a junk car out there.
right?
So here I am by having this dialogue, I'm saying something that a non-native person driving through the reservation might think, but they're not going to say it out loud. But I said it out loud. So anyone reading the book, that book sees me ask the questions that they would want to ask. And then I also allowed Dan to talk about issues that mattered to him, that were a different perspective on our own cultural reality, like the difference between leaders and rulers, about how they took a leader as someone who was needed for a period of time, and then was no longer when they were no longer needed, they were a warrior leader, a camp leader, they would then withdraw. Whereas we elect people, and he says, how can a person be determined to be a leader for 4 years and say that's a legitimate time for them to be a leader? That's making them a ruler. And so he would talk about the difference between leaders and rulers. He talked about the power of silence and language, things that most people don't think about. And the teachers who would get these books would read them and say, oh my God, I never understood, because they'd have the Indian kids in their classes who kept their eyes down and wouldn't answer a question. And they would say, these kids, what's wrong? Cat's got your tongue? How come? Give me an answer. Well, the children had been trained to give the product of their thought, not to think out loud. And Dan said, all you want them to do is start talking. You don't care what they say. You just want them to start talking. They are keeping their eyes down and not looking at you because they think that's a sign of respect to not look in your eyes. And so it's not avoiding you, it's respecting you. And they don't speak right up because they're processing their thoughts. When they have their thoughts properly formulated, then they will give you an answer. So these kind of insights were things that a lot of non-native people had never seen, never heard, and didn't know about. And the native people would say, yeah, you're finally, someone's finally talking about this. And so that combination of me keeping my own identity and me letting them tell their stories and weaving it into a story that in all three books, I try to make them compelling stories about the experience. And there's usually a mystery in the story. And so that was how it happened. And they caught hold. They caught hold at a time when no one else was doing this kind of thing. And now I've sort of had to hand it off to the young native writers. They've come along and they're doing a great job. But I was needed at the time because no one was speaking up from the native values and the native point of view. And I just happened to fall into it. And I love the native people and said, this is a skill I can do. It's my way of, I thought my way of paying rent for my time on Earth was going to be sculpture, but it ended up being writing books that tried to explicate and reveal native reality to the broader populace.
Are there some young native writers that you would recommend folks to?
Well, I mean, everyone seems to be reading Tommy Orange. Uh, I've not read him. I frankly haven't kept up with the young writers. I've been, working with my own writing, my own last. You know, it's like I have to now speak as an elder. This is my last go round. Again, one of the native values that I really believe in is that we don't look at our life in our Western linear fashion of from birth to death, and in between is this period of productivity and fecundity, and then at the end you become sort of vestigial and you either fade away or you go out and play golf or in some cases refuse to leave the presidency. But so you don't you don't understand the world in the way the native people do. And the native people say it's like the seasons. And this is how every native tradition will say this, that they're the young, if you're in the fourth season of life, which I'm in, the winter of life, the only one who's been in the winter of life has seen the other three seasons before. So therefore, when you reach the fourth season of life, when you reach the status of being an elder, your responsibility is to give back because you have got a perspective that no one else has. So I've been spending my time trying to figure out what I can best do in these last years of my life. And so I really have not kept up on the young native writers. I haven't kept up on much of the native world. It's been since the pandemic, it's been a very meditative and reflective time for me. And I'm trying to formulate things so I can make the necessary statements that I have to make in the time that I have left.
There's a lot of things that I want to ask you about that I think would be helpful for people to hear. But in early on in the book, it's funny you don't even tell us Dan's name.
No.
The main protagonist, I guess you could say in the book. You don't even tell us that until way into the first.
Oh, really? So I didn't know that. So I don't mention his name until.
No, I don't think so. I don't think you mentioned it until, like 20 pages in or so.
Huh.
You refer to him as the old man, or you kind of dance around ways to describe him. But talk about the when you first met him and how you came together, and maybe a little bit about that dance that you engaged in with him.
Well, here's the great irony and the great difficulty. Dan said that I don't want to be known. I don't consider myself a spokesperson for the Native people. I like what you did with the students. I think you've got some skills. I think you have the capacity to help me tell the Native story. But you can't, I don't want anyone to be able to find me. All right, so how do you tell a person's story and hide the person so they can't be found? Well, the first thing is I named him Dan in honor of three men named Dan that I knew, three Native men, ironically, that were all very important to me. And so I gave him the name Dan, and I constructed his visual presence in a way that was based on one of the three men, but really wasn't the way that the original Dan actually looked. So I've got this character that I've created and keeping hidden from anyone so they can't find him. And so that's where a lot of the trouble came with people saying fiction, nonfiction. He's not a composite. He's one person, but he's constructed in a way that you couldn't find him. In fact, there was one friend of mine, a man to whom I'm dedicating part of my next book. Bud is one of the people to whom I'm dedicating my book. This other man, Leonard Littlefinger, was a Lakota man from Pine Ridge, and he said, "I know who Dan was. I've tracked him out. I've followed this. I've gone through the book. I've seen every place you went. I know who he was." And I said, "Leonard, you ain't getting that out of me. I'm not going to tell you," and I never did. So, so the first engagement with the man who's the primary figure of Dan was him trusting me because the kids trusted me and because the elders trusted me. And they figure the kids are an excellent barometer of sort of the spiritual legitimacy of a person. And the fact that I just love the students I worked with. In fact, you can go online, and just a couple of weeks ago, I was up in northern Minnesota and did an interview uh, on the Red Lake radio and station with one of my students. He's a grandfather now, and they move quick, yeah, they become grandparents real fast. But anyway, no, and I stayed with these people. I loved these students, and the elders saw this. This Dan saw it. And what he said to me was something I never forgot. He said, "Always teach by stories because stories lodge deep in the heart." So that became my watchword. I have to teach by stories. I cannot teach by analysis. Leave that for somebody else. Leave the intellectualizing and the critical analysis and contextualizing to somebody else. Walk people into a story and tell the story because that lodges deep in the heart. So he and I talked about it, and what he said was, "I want you to tell the story of the Native people. If you have good insights from other people, put them in my mouth." And so he became almost not a straw man. That's not the term I want, but he was a living invention based in a person that allowed me to walk through Native reality and bring in the stories from other Native people. Now, Grover was a much easier person to deal with. That's for those who don't know, Grover was Dan's best friend, and Grover was easy to base on a single person because I mean he's exactly on target, but no one would know him because they don't know where you know they don't know who Dan is. So Grover was just sort of an acolyte and a friend to Dan. And so Dan he's an elusive figure. He's a chimera. He's a vehicle for teaching, but he's a real person. And so that's where all the trouble has come with this book for the critics is, what in the world is this? Is it fact? Is it fiction? And I say, well, they ask me that, and I say, well, yes, it is. It's fact and it's fiction. And they say, well, maybe what you might want to say is it's neither wolf nor dog. It's right in between. But has been a teaching story. Dan let me use him as a teaching story. So again, this is a squishy, elusive answer, but that's the way the whole book is. You can't, and that's some of its magic. no one can find this man, and he's no longer alive. So that was simple enough. But
And
I
you
don't know
never
that
mentioned
anyone.
reservation. You never
But
mentioned what reservation.
nope, I never mention what reservation. I just say South Dakota. Yeah,
Right.
and there are a lot of reservations on South Dakota.
Hmm.
And I mean, the real places, of course, that we travel through. I mean, Wounded Knee is a real place.
Right.
Going into Mobridge, across from the Indian boarding schools, the old Indian boarding school is a real place. These are real places, but that doesn't say where the origin point was. It just says where the journey went.
Well, there's, you know, he, I think it's not only you but Dan who mentions the fact that 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 so many people want to see written records, and that is completely anathema to
Mhm.
the Indian tradition. And uh, how did you find it sort of an opportunity for you to be more open to the process when you were writing because of that, or that it was more challenging?
Well, I think it was actually more open because I prefer to hear people's stories than to read them. And you you get inconsistencies in in and I learned that from the oral history project that we did, and from just my life as sort of an auditor and a listener. I would find that there are inconsistencies in people's stories, or from one person to another. And so by letting Dan and Grover and Winona in particular tell their stories, they could tell a story that might be in contradiction to a story that another person would tell. Like Dan's insistence that he was not greatly in favor of white people getting involved in Native spirituality. And there are a lot of Native people who think that was the Creator's gift to us. And our job is to pass that along. What we were given is we were a spiritual people, and we were given this, and our job is to pass this along. Well, Dan didn't think that way. He thought instead that you're looking at this, at our spirituality and us as like jewelry on American culture. You've got a certain spiritual emptiness in your own being, and that's your problem. It's not ours to solve. So when I hear a story like this, I would be able to put it in there without feeling I needed to put a counter story or a correction or anything that would contextualize it. And for that reason, I preferred to work not from written documents, but from oral documents. And you could hear, sometimes you'd hear a little thing. I mean, I remember, and I actually put this in Grover's mouth, I believe, in the second book, that this came from an experience I had sitting with a man at a restaurant, and native man, and I asked him, how come you guys, look what happened to you from the American government. And yet when it comes time for the wars in World War II, you guys were the first to sign up. You go, you fight for this country that tried to destroy you. And this man said to me, oh, no, I didn't fight. I wasn't fighting for our country. I was fighting for our land. And I thought, boom, there it is. So I frame this little thing in. And then when it comes time, when I can use this in Grover's voice, in this case, I'll put that in as Grover saying it. And so you would find things like this that Dan is saying along the way that are right from the mouth of Native people. And that they have a life when they come from the mouth of someone, much more than when they come from a written document. Because people, if someone's writing a document, they either are reflecting upon it or they're clarifying their thinking to put it in the best possible way. But when they're speaking, if you get someone speaking from the heart, you just get the real truth, the real story, and you get the real emotion. So I would much prefer to work from the stories than from the written documents.
Well, that was fortunate because you started off on this project with an armful of documents
Uh-huh.
that disappeared.
I got slapped down pretty well for that. Yeah. I mean, trying to be, trying to set up these categories of analysis, thoughts on the land, thoughts on, well, like we mentioned, leadership, thoughts on this, thoughts on that. No, that wasn't the way to do it. The way to do it was to let the stories unfold in their own organic fashion. Yeah, that's one of the things that if I think that people enjoy about the book is that in no way, in any of the books, in no way do I make myself into the hero. That it's not the white man gets wisdom. It's white man uh, gets schooled. He and
But
and because that really was, and that's what I think the Native people like. Like I say, it's kind of a cowboy and Indians book, but the Indians win. And so that was the approach that I would take to it. Is everything I tried, I would, if it didn't work, they would tell me, or if they'd, and I got frustrated with that. And then at the point at which I was ready to come home and say, I don't need this crap. No one's thanking me for anything that I'm doing. No one's thanking me for trying to tell Dan's story. And Winona just turns on me and she gives it to me with both barrels about who do I think I am. And that putting that kind of dialogue in the book allows people to see both how I was thinking about it and how I did get schooled. And so it was really, it has an authenticity that I think you wouldn't have if I was dealing with documents.
well, right from the very beginning, you explore uh, some of the some of the great uh, sort of cultural differences, and one of them is the differences between land and property.
Mm-hmm.
And I think not so much for folks like me who have been around a while and understand that, but for the younger crowd, talk about that, about why that's important to understand.
And if you look upon the land as something living, as Dan said, how can you talk about owning your grandmother? That it's just it's not proper languaging. If the native people, they had territories that they might have hunted in, they might have camped in, that they might have had their stories revealed in. Like you mentioned earlier that we might talk about the Nez Perce book that I did. The
Hmm.
Nez Perce had on their land a something called ant fighting with hornet, and it's an arch where there's one side goes up and hits the other, and it's an ant and hornet uh, who are uh, can sort of involved in a conflict and a confrontation, and that they get frozen into this place their uh, by the creator and frozen into this arch. And so every time the elders or the teachers would take the kids out, they'd say, "See, this is what happens to you if you get involved in arguments. You just get frozen in place." So this kind of approach to land as something that's alive, full of teachings, and given to you, and also something where your people have died, been buried, and gone back to the soil, and then grown up through the plants, and the animals eat the plants, and then your spirit is in the animals, and then they die and they go back into the earth, and this sort of recycling makes the land alive and important to you. But the idea that you would draw lines on it and say, I own this piece of land it's anathema, and it also is wrong-headed. Like they said, it's like saying, they talked about how if you were a native, if when someone came into the land, it's like said, well, someone took an arrow and shot it into the air and said, well, I own the air up to where as far as the arrow went. They said, that makes no sense. Or if I went out in a boat and I own the water out as far as I went in my boat. They said, that's what it was like for us, for you to come and to say, you own this property. You can't own it. And once they started drawing lines and fencing it off, which mostly was done to change things from a hunting and gathering traditions from hunting and gathering traditions into agricultural and farming traditions, you're breaking the spirit of the land as this living, breathing mass. And we just, I mean, we just automatically think of land as property at this point. And yet we don't go very far back. You know, that if you think about the land you're on, I mean, not in general, but like right now, under my butt, under my chair, under my, down under the foundation of my house where I'm sitting, who lived here? What was their life? How did they live on this particular piece of property? And I think of it as property. They didn't. But if we go back right to the origins of the land that we're on and say, okay, there were people living here, we might think of it a little differently. Usually we only go back to the time when it was first written down, first documented, first measured, and then sold in chunks. And that is, to their mind, and I've come to believe it the same way, it's wrong-headed. It's the way you have to live in the world today, but it's not necessarily the way that I wish it were and the wish that it should be.
And do you think that sort of points to an even larger question, that the direction that we need to go as a world, with all the challenges that face us, that there are real answers in the philosophies of various Indian nations that could help us. I mean, I've heard, for example, leaders in the Lakota Nation talk uh, about the fact that we are about to enter a period of sort of great challenges, but with huge opportunities for people to start listening better to one another and getting along. And I'm rambling a bit here, but I'm sorry.
I
But
know
I'm
you're
looking
doing.
for some hope in the current situation that we're in.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I've stayed committed to the Native people and the Native story as sort of the extension of my interest in the spiritual dimension of life. That I've got a number of Native friends. There's one in particular I'm thinking of, who is I think he's Tlingit, in Alaska, and he's got stories from the elders that we've like and he swears that this is what the time is coming when everything is broken. And when everything is broken, that's when you can reconfigure it. And that's when the native way of understanding starts to have some potential, because it doesn't say that it's broken and can't be fixed. It says that you've forgotten the lessons of the elder cultures on this land. And I think of, I've pretty much spent time with the Ojibwe, the Lakota, and the Nez Perce. Those have been the three groups that I've studied the most or lived with the most. And one thing I found, that the one universal that all of them have, they're all very different and they're in some ways, then traditionally they've almost been adversarial in some cases, but they all believe that everything has spirit in it. And that once you have to look upon the world as everything having spirit and the possibility of teaching. Like I mentioned, that the rock, the ant and the bee, or the ant and the grasshopper, hornet and ant, yeah, that everything teaches us. Uh, again, you talk about rambling. Let me ramble here. My friend, the son of my friend, my Tlingit friend, came to visit me in northern Minnesota, and we went out for a walk. And that time we were living on a little dirt road, and going out for a walk, and I had my dog with us. And Lucy was a yellow lab who's sweeter than she was smart, and she'd engaged with a porcupine once before, and it hadn't been successful from her point of view. So we're out for a walk, and Lucy sees a porcupine, and my friend Martin and I, the young man and I, were walking. I said, "Oh God, I got to get her away from the porcupine." So that those are mean little suckers. And he said, they're not mean, they're kind. They have so much power, and yet they're never aggressive. They never attack anyone. They only defend that which is theirs. They move slowly. They look at the world around them. They don't try to hide from anyone, and they never are aggressive. They're actually very kind, very good teachers because of the way that they withhold using their power. And I'm thinking, geez, I thought it was something was going to shoot porcupine, shoot quills into my dog again. And that kind of way of looking at the earth and looking at the land, the native people see in everything. And I don't even know, I'd have to sit with sit with people every day to hear the way that they see a particular tree. Like they'll say a tree, well, that tree holds its hands out in praise. It sticks its hands up in praise. When we see a tree, an oak tree with its limbs out, that reminds us that we need to pray to the Creator. And so this way of looking at the world as teaching us rather than us imposing our will upon the world is something that is inherent in the native way of doing things, and that is a paradigm shift that we need to have. We look upon everything with its utilitarian value. What can we make of it? What can we do with it? How can we make it improve the life of the human being, which is the top of the top of the creative pyramid, the top of creation, the top of the mountain of creation. And they don't see it this way. They say we instead are, though we learn from the world around us, we are the last of creation. Whether you look upon it as that we were created last, or whether you look at it from evolution, whatever, every tradition, every way says we came last. Well, everything that was here before us didn't need us. We need everything else. We need to start looking upon this world with a sense of humility and gratitude. That's a native value. Another native value that I find inherent in almost all the traditions, and we see this in other traditions as well, but it's very strong in the native traditions, is the family is larger than a nuclear family. I would have my students would come home in Red Lake and say, I didn't get my homework done. And I said, well, why? I'd say, well, I didn't go home last night. So, well, what do you mean? I thought that meant that you're out catting around. I said, no, I went to my auntie's house. Well, the auntie is the same as the mother. She just has a different perspective. But so the auntie and the mother are seen as the same. The uncle is seen as having a wisdom to teach the young boys because he doesn't have the really sort of fraught relationship that the father does with the son. So the family is a larger unit. You will learn well about the family as a larger unit. There are just all of these different teachings within the native way of seeing that would allow us to look upon the world with a sort of more benign, less adversarial, and less closed point of view. And I want to mention this, that I wrote a little book called Voices in the Stones, where I tried to lay out the lessons that I've learned and extract all the lessons I've gotten from Dan and from the other Native people I've worked with, and Nez Perce, the ones on Red Lake, and to put them in the stories in Voices in the Stone. So if anyone wants to see what I really think are the lessons that we should learn from the Native people that we can bring into our culture and start to look towards healing and unifying, then I suggest they do it, because that's really my goal, is to see that we're headed down a bad path. And the first step is to see that we're headed down a bad path. And I don't think anyone from any political perspective right now thinks that things are going in a really good direction. We might have momentary hope, but ultimately it's like we're using up the world's resources. We're not looking far enough ahead to see what's going to happen to the earth. We're trying to deny what's going on. We need a paradigm shift. And to have a paradigm shift, you have to have something to shift that paradigm to. And though we're seeing things falling apart, we haven't found a paradigm that we can trust. And I think if we look closely at the native way of understanding the world, there is an alternative paradigm that we could look to.
Right. Absolutely. Now, uh, one of my great heroes in my life has been Chief Joseph, and you wrote a book about um, Joseph and the flight of the Nez Perce. Um, and maybe you'd talk a little bit not only about writing it, but about Joseph and his impact even today.
Joseph is one of my heroes as well. Joseph and Sitting Bull both. Joseph, I came upon Joseph again by accident when I was teaching at Red Lake. Uh, I wanted the students to know the thinking of the native people that had come before. Like I said, I didn't want to impose my own value system on them. So I would give them snippets of the speeches of many of the great leaders. And Joseph just fascinated me for his clarity of thought about what it meant to be alive and a human on this earth. And so when I left working at Red Lake, I said, I would like to write a book on Chief Joseph. What I'd like to do is to take my son on a journey. He was 12 at the time. And we were living in a small town, and I was casting a big shadow over him. It's always, oh, you're Kent's son, you're Kent's son. And I didn't want to cast that shadow. And I said, let me give him a better model of a worthy manhood, a different model than his own father. So I proposed this book, and the publisher, in their wisdom, sitting in their towers in San Francisco eating sushi, said it sounds, and I mean that's right specifically because our argument became sushi versus salmon at one point. But anyway, so they said, yeah, go ahead. And I started researching Joseph, and I was all set to take this journey. And a previous book of mine had come out called Road Angels, and it was a journey down the West Coast, and it bombed. And they said, oh, well, you just did a road book and it didn't work. We don't want you doing another road book. We want you to do is we want you to do a biography of Joseph. And I threw up my hands and said, I'm not capable of doing a biography of Joseph. I'm not a biographer. I'm not an historian. And one more white man doing a book about a native person is not going to have very much success and will not be looked upon favorably by the native people. Well, in going and talking to the native people, the Nez Perce, one of them said, there's great division in our tribe and between the Joseph people and those who were opposed to the journey that he and his followers took. If you can heal that division, see, because we can't, because we're part of that division, then it's worthwhile for you to do that book. So I undertook this book about the journey of Joseph and his what how many people I forget. It's been years since I did the book, but there were I think 800 people that they traveled from Eastern Oregon and the border of Oregon and Idaho through Montana and came up into they ended up at the Bear's Paw right by the Canadian border where they were surrounded. They'd been followed by seven armies along the way. And they had the women, they had the children, they had the blind, they had the elderly, and it was a tragic, tragic journey. And I assumed it had the end point was where Joseph hands the gun over to Colonel Miles and says, "From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." That's all I'd ever known about Joseph, is what I thought this was all about. Well, in the studying and following this journey, traveling these lands, and you can travel almost the exact journey they went on, I discovered it was a very different story. Joseph was not the leader. Joseph was he was against this. He didn't think anyone could survive this journey. He thought they would be better served by accepting some conditions and staying on the reservation. But that was being set up for them. But he was willing to go if the other chiefs and the young men said, we have to make this journey. So Joseph, what I really ended up studying was a man who was a camp chief. And what he taught me, and I've always kept it ever since, was about leadership, that he led from behind. He did not lead from the front. We were always raised to, oh, you're not exercising your leadership potential, we were told when we were in grade school or whatever. And here was a man who led from behind. He was the camp chief. He made sure no one got left behind. It was a type of quiet leadership. And only at the end, after the more dominant sort of point of the spear leaders had gotten killed, was Joseph left as the leader. They could have made it across the border into Canada, but he wasn't going to leave the women and children. So that was why he surrendered at that point. They were only 30 miles from the Canadian border, but he surrendered because he said, I'm not going to try to subject the women and children to any more suffering on this journey. So the book then follows them from their surrender. It tells the story of the journey and then follows them from their surrender down into Kansas and Oklahoma, where they were taken and betrayed over and over again, and eventually brought back to the Pacific Northwest. But Joseph was never allowed to go back to his homelands, and that's all he ever wanted to do, was to go back to the homelands where his father had been buried, where the bones of his father were. And so the book was a 4-year study, a journey, a 4-year study of a man and his people and their journey. And it's one of the most poignant in American history. And they actually, they helped Lewis and Clark. There were one tribe that helped Lewis and Clark when they came through. They showed that Lewis and Clark used their trail through the Bitterroot Mountains, or they would never have made it through in the winter, crossing the Bitterroots to get out to the Columbia. And it's a story of a story that I try to tell from the ground level. Again, the whole idea is always to write so you're there with me. And in this case, you're there with them. I don't want anyone to say, oh, this is going to happen. We understand what's going to happen in the future. I want you to be there with the Native people. I want you to be there with these terrified young soldiers, many of whom had come over from Europe, had never seen anything other than the forests of Czechoslovakia or Germany, and are suddenly out west seeing these men on horseback in an arid land of hills and chasms that they don't know how to cross with no training and no bullets. I want you to see their world. I want you to see the world of the frightened settlers. I wanted everyone to tell their story from their point of view. So in many ways, it's not that different from either the Oral History Project, neither Wolf nor Dog, and the following books, because I want to give everyone the authenticity of their story. And at the heart of it is Joseph, this leader from behind, who gets thrust into the position of being almost a mythological leader by the people who are watching this from the East Coast, but ultimately saw his task as to quietly take care of those people that were put in his charge. And he became a hero to me because of that, because of his quiet strength. And he to this day remains someone that I look to when I think of how I should try to live my life and how I should try to teach people about meaningful leadership and meaningful sharing and power.
You do such a beautiful job of showing Joseph's empathy, not only for the people in his group, but even for the soldiers,
Right.
And who were pursuing them, and they were desperately trying to make it up to join Sitting Bull in Canada, but he was even cognizant of the tragedies and the travails of those people who were chasing them, and I think that built a lot of respect from within his tribe. But you do just a beautiful job of showing how he may perhaps began the journey as less of the obvious leader, and then grew into this giant by the end.
And there is And you hit on that. There's a core of empathy, and when empathy can go across barriers of where there's real adversarial relationships and cruelty on both sides, but empathy for the common humanity that transcends the conflict, even though the conflict sometimes has to continue and the conflict has to be played out. Joseph never lost sight of the fact that these soldiers were just young boys uh, out there who were being set against him. And a lot of this really is measured against the murder of Custer, because the Lakota had in the killing of Custer had not only been very brutal, uh, they were treated in the press as these terribly brutal savages and sort of not subhuman creatures. So when Joseph would find these young boys who were shot and have the women go out and give them water, these young soldiers who were sent against them, and have them go out and say, "Poor boy, you're too young to die," and give them water to try to help them heal. It was like this was it made no sense to anyone because it was a different order of human being. And to me, the real dilemma that we face in a situation like that is his kindness and his goodness were met with betrayal. And that's always one of the hardest questions we have to face as human beings. If we present our best self to the world and try to live with empathy and caring and kindness, and there are people that take advantage of that as a grounds for betraying us and using that to gain power over us, what's the appropriate way to answer that question? I mean, it's a universal challenge. How
Mm.
did the Jews who stood before the Nazis and said, "No, we are not going to fight. We instead believe there's a higher order of justice, and we are going to try to assert that," and then get shot and pushed into pits? What is the right way to respond to that sort of anger and maybe even evil, but certainly cultural conflict? And Joseph, he responded with magnanimity and spiritual greatness. And in fact, it's a slight slide over, but I mentioned Sitting Bull, and I try to start and end almost all of my talks, and it's in the head in front of many of my books. Sitting Bull got together after his people had been almost decimated by the U.S. government and said, "Come, let us put our minds together to see what sort of lives we can create for our children." And that sort of greatness of spirit is in the native character. And somehow they have survived in the face of all of our attempts to eradicate them through annihilation, through acculturation, through removal. They have remained. And so there has to be some sort of spiritual power in that way of looking at the world that says, I look with magnanimity upon my enemy and adversaries. And that to me is who I always look to Joseph whenever I find myself in a situation where I have to make a decision like that. And it hasn't always worked, but it's you have to stand for something. And he gave me a model of something to stand for.
If we can assert our common humanity
Mm-hmm.
under even the most difficult circumstances, uh, we can at least consider ourselves to have lived honorable lives.
Absolutely.
And
And in
that's
the end,
what they teach us.
yeah, and that in the end, that's about what each of us has, is to say that I met every moment with compassion and honor, that I could be trusted. I am at my best who it is that I claim to be. And that was, again, one of the lines that one of the Native people has said was, always try to be the person that you want yourself to be. And we aren't always the person that we want ourselves to be. We, there's there's the person, the feet of clay, and then there's the head in the sky. And yet, if you insist on trying, saying, I'm willing to accept that I will be used, people will take advantage of me, that I will be mocked, I will be looked upon as a naive. Nonetheless, on balance, from my perspective at this point in life, is meeting the world with kindness and compassion is always the best way to go. It may not be the way that gets you to the absolute top of the, political or economic heap, but it allows you to, go gently on that glide path into the end saying, I was an honorable human being. I was a good man.
Kent Nerburn, thank you so much for it's been a real honor to talk with you.
Well, I'm glad you had me, and I sort of disappeared from the public forum during the pandemic and trying to figure out what to do, who to do, how to become an elder. But I hope people will look to my books because they're meant to be teaching books. I always look upon myself as a teacher. And so, as one Native man said to me, he said, you're falling down on the job, Nerburn. He said, you should be out there, making people learn these things, read these books. I said, yeah, but that's self-promotion. I don't like self-promotion. I'm not good. He said, no. You're telling our story. And if you don't tell our story, then you're not doing what we called upon you to do. So if any of you want to get a look at the way the Native people see the world and what they may have to offer to the rest of us as we sort of fumble our way into the darkness here, I'd say take a look at those books because I think I did capture something. I'm just a vehicle in these books and hopefully a good one. And the fact that you asked me on is a great compliment to me and I appreciate it.
Well, in our show notes, I will put information about all the books that you've mentioned today, but others as well. And I can't recommend highly enough these books to folks who are watching or listening to this. And it's been my honor to have this chance.
And in memory of Bud.
Memory of Bud.
All right. Thanks a lot, Wayne.
Take care.
See you later.
This song is dedicated to the people of the world and all its inhabitants. We've got to learn to live together with some understanding and care for each other. Let's go the extra mile and do it with a smile. Said if it's true, tell me why we cannot try. Tell me why, yes, if there is a reason why. If it's true, tell me why we cannot try. We always feel that there is something sweeter. Ouch! Got to realize that we could do a bit better. Find more solutions and share with each other. They taught me from the Bible. If it's true, tell me why we cannot try. Tell me why, yes, if there is a reason why. Oh, tell me why we cannot try harder. We've got the rights to talk.